Hey everybody, it's your host, Diana Chen, and you're listening to an episode of MINIHASH, a condensed episode of Rehash where we do a deep dive into one focused topic with a past guest. Hope you enjoy. Hello, Spencer. Welcome back to Rehash for a MINIHASH episode. I cannot believe that it's been almost 3 years since we technically had you on the podcast. It just doesn't feel that long because we talk all the time. And we did that little podcast mini-series collaboration with Hats Protocol that you were a big part of. So I feel like we podcasted together quite a bit. But technically, your last solo appearance as a guest on Rehash was almost 3 years ago. So welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. It does feel like it's been less time than 3 years, although I think I could say that about so many of the things that we have all been doing over the last handful of years. Like somebody said that they had shared a paper or like a framework 2 years ago. I was like, I feel like I read that last month. Like, I don't know where the time has gone. And
that's exactly how I feel about your anti-capture framework, which is what we're here to talk about today. This whole conversation came about because Nicole, a mutual friend who's also part of HatsDAO, dropped a link in the HatsDAO chat a couple of months ago. It was an opinion piece from the New York Times about state capture, about who is actually running the US federal government nowadays, which sounds like it should be a pretty simple question, but actually isn't so simple now. And that just the first thing I thought of when she dropped that article was your anti-capture framework. And I was like, oh my God, this is playing out in real life. Not that like when you wrote that piece, it wasn't relevant or it wasn't understandable, but I just think that what we've seen play out since you wrote that article 3 years ago has made what you wrote back then feels so much more relevant and so much more obvious. And like, man, you wrote this 3 years ago. Like if only more people have paid attention and followed your framework and cared a little bit more, maybe we wouldn't be in the position we are in today. So to kick us off, maybe just give listeners a little refresher, since it has been over 3 years since you wrote this article, about what your anti-capture framework was all about.
Yeah, and since it's been 3 years, I might cheat a little bit and refer to it on the side.
Totally.
It's not fully loaded into memory anymore. I guess a little background that might help is that this framework came out of like a philosophical research journey that I went on back in like sort of the 2021 and then into 2022 period of lots of things being thrown into the category of DAOs and nobody having any idea what a DAO was. And we may still not, but especially then. And there were all these conversations about, is this a DAO? Is that a DAO? And I felt like I needed a better way to understand that just for myself. And so started digging into what this stuff could even mean. And then what I ended up landing on after pulling my hair maybe literally out for like 6 months was this framework that really is very, very basic in a sense and doesn't really give any answers as to like how to make something less susceptible to capture. All it really does is provide a framework and a language and some concepts for talking about and analyzing where capture might be more risky or where careful attention needs to be paid. And then at the end, I was able to like use that language and that framework to at least have a first pass at what I think makes a DAO, or like really defining a DAO in a sort of principled way. And what anti-capture attempts to do is creates a simple model of an organization or a community or a network as a network of individual nodes or agents. Not necessarily AI agents, but they certainly could be. But just people, groups of people, AIs, computers, other software, etc. And when they sort of are interacting, sometimes they have a set of resources that they share, that they sort of collectively control. And when that happens, and especially when they're using those resources to do something, then you get an organization. That's what an organization roughly is. But when you have shared resources, you have issues. You have to figure out how to use them, and you have to figure out how to protect them from capture or theft or abuse by both actors or agents that are inside of the organization, as well as from agents or actors or maybe other organizations from outside the organization. So what a DAO does at least in theory, is it resists capture from internal agents and external agents, which is a totally unique combination. Traditional companies, et cetera, they're like set up to be within this broader system of like the United States or whatever other legal system. And so they're susceptible to external capture quite easily. That legal system, though, provides a lot of protections against internal capture. But what we see in practice is that's usually not good enough. And corporate governance is riddled with fraud and abuse and corruption and extraction by executives and all sorts of things. And so what DAOs can, at least again in theory, do a better job of is creating protections against and resisting capture by internal agents. And one of the things that I felt like was, and maybe even still is misunderstood, is that the part of taking actions with shared resources that is most sensitive to capture, or where we really need to be paying attention to how we're constructing our systems to make sure they're resilient to capture, is not what most people think about, which is decision making, but in fact, it's execution. Those are two phases of what the framework describes as a 4-phase cycle of taking an action, which starts with proposal, like setting the agenda for what you're going to decide. The second phase is deciding what is the action or option that you are selecting. And then third is execution, was actually putting that into manifesting that, making it real in the world. And then the fourth one is sort of reviewing or assessing or evaluating how that went. And often those are cyclical, right? So you take an action, you review it, you figure out what you're going to do next. But decision making is what so many people think about or talk about as where all the power lies. And so we have to decentralize decision making. And that's oftentimes a good thing to do. And you can get lots of different viewpoints and make sure that a decision that is made reflects the interests of many, which is oftentimes what we want to do in DAOs and distributed communities. But from a capture perspective, that doesn't matter if the execution phase is highly centralized. And this is what was happening with a lot of DAOs that were set up to be token plus snapshot plus multi-sig, where the snapshot was where decisions were made, but the multi-sig, controlled by a handful of friends, was usually able to, at least they could just ignore everything that the token holders were doing in snapshot because they had the executive power, the execution power. And so that is what we really need to make sure that we decentralize the control over. And I think when it comes to DAOs and smart contracts, we can get a really concrete sense of what that is. It's much fuzzier when it comes to other organizations and maybe even legal kind of systems and political systems. It's not always easy to translate directly between them, but if we use like the basic concepts, I think we can.
Yeah, it's interesting that you wrote this framework in the context of DAOs, thinking really heavily about DAOs, but it really does apply to so many areas of our lives. And I think you shouted out a couple of examples outside of crypto and blockchain and DAOs in your article towards the beginning as examples of where we've historically seen anti-capture happening. And you said, for example, an executive embezzles funds from his firm for a lavish vacation, or a politician accepts campaign contributions, these sorts of things. I'm willing to bet when you wrote this that you were not envisioning the level of state capture that we have seen play out in the US to this scale when you wrote this article and when you included some examples about, campaign funds and things of that nature. Am I correct?
Yeah, I don't think I was... I'll say it like this. I don't think I'm terribly shocked by what's happening. It's still striking, and I definitely wasn't thinking about this happening to the magnitude that it is. But some of the challenges that we as a country, from a structural perspective, are facing now, were, I think, evident for quite some time.
Right. So looking at our current climate, how would you sort of analyze what's happening in the US government today using your anti-capture framework?
So I think one way to think about it is it comes down to that distinction between decision-making and executive authority. There's been a lot of assumptions, I think, within the US government and politics that if a certain body or set of voters decided a certain way, then those desires would be carried out by the executive branch or by whoever had the executive authority. And I think one thing that's becoming much, much clearer is that if you give a certain executive set of people kind of unlimited power to do stuff, like to actually execute actions, then it really doesn't matter what the people say they should do. They can just go off and do a ton of things. And we see this in lots of different ways, but Doge is probably the most acute form of this, or acute and like visible and salient form of this, where we have somebody who was able to leverage their extreme amount of social influence and monetary influence into a position of unelected authority that is at least purportedly acting on behalf of an elected official, but in ways that totally go against all of the norms and expectations of how the executive branch or certain parts of the executive branch would behave or act, and undermining the actual legislative bodies, which are the decision-making bodies. One of the challenges is how to think about, like, if we have a legislative body and a judicial body and an executive body, and one of the problems is that the executive, at least in terms of how I think about it in the anti-capture framework, that's where all the real hard power lies. We have to think about how, like, maybe that's not the way things should work. Maybe we should have multiple bodies with actual executive power and not just one. And this is also where some of those challenges of like translating between things that are very, very clearly visible on smart contracts versus widespread socially enforced stuff like that, it's a little bit difficult and interesting and to explore, but also nuanced and challenging in a short amount of time. Like, this is where those differences create challenges for us in talking about this stuff, or maybe even thinking about how things should work.
So I think maybe where that line between the decision making and the execution phase maybe gets a little bit blurred or confusing is oftentimes the people who are in charge of making the decisions or have the power to make decisions are also the people that have power to execute. And so whatever decision is being made is also being executed on. And so in that sense, there's sometimes in practice little distinction between decision making and execution. And I'm wondering, like, in the context of the US government, for example, if you see a potential way to prevent capture in the US government to be that checks and balances system of having the multiple branches of government all with different levels of power. Do you see that as sort of like when the country was formed and when the government was formed, that was like the level of protection offered to prevent capture? And what we're seeing play out now is that is kind of being ignored. And, the judges' decisions are being ignored. So the judicial branch is essentially rendered useless, or at least in practice. Yeah, I'm curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah. I think there's a couple things going on. One is that the executive branch, as the executors, have, if they want to and don't care about norms or whatever other people think, they have the ability to ignore the decision makers or the judges. But the other thing, which I think makes that worse or sort of exacerbates that problem, is that while we do have these checks and balances, they work under an assumption that there is not going to be like collusion between members of those different branches. And one of the things that I worry about a lot, both in the real world or like in real, like IRL governments and in DAO and crypto governance more generally, is the risk of tribalism. Because when you have tribalism, all of the incentives for the checks and balances are totally gone, because you have people that are tribally associated across the different bodies, and then they adhere more to each other and they align more to each other than to the responsibilities and authorities that their particular body has. So the like assumptions in the construction of the US Constitution are just like totally incorrect at this point, because the tribalism is so extreme. And I don't have a ton of answers for how to certainly not in the United States or in like global politics, but even in how do we protect against tribalism sort of emerging within our nascent kind of DAOs and other communities? I don't know the answer. And that kind of keeps me up at night sometimes, because like you can design all of the structures and mechanisms that you want, but if everybody just ignores those because they want to align with all the other people in their tribe, then I don't really know. I do think there's some interesting research going on. There's a new draft paper out by Pooja Olhaver, I think I'm saying her name right, called Community Currencies, that attempts to address this like dichotomy really, or this challenge really, really head on. But that's pretty early in its process. And I think we need a lot more research and thinking on how to avoid that trap of tribalism.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is how do you think we can avoid this? Why do you think the nation is just becoming so much more polarized on opposite ends of the spectrum? Because I think it's something that the the crypto community could be susceptible to as well, and DAOs can be susceptible to as well. I think anybody that works in crypto knows just how culty it can feel at many times. And so, I'm curious to, like, if you've thought about where those points of failure might eventually happen in the crypto space, like it has in the federal government in our country, or like anything that we can do before we get there that can prevent this outcome.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts, and I don't know if they're comprehensive here, but I think one of the challenges that a nation state government has is that it has to do everything. Like, it is relevant for everything, or at least relevant for all the domains. Like, it has to make decisions and have policies about individual rights and liberties or not. And it has to have policies about like business and economics and finance and public goods and all sorts of things. And it's very difficult to like find a set of people that agree about a lot of those things. And it's also, I think, an underrated challenge is that some of those things are in the domain of zero sum like competition. And some of those things are in the domain of positive sum building and like lifting everybody up. At least they conceivably could be. And I think one of the benefits that we can get with more narrowly focused protocols and communities and organizations is that they only need to focus on a couple of those things at one time. And it becomes more likely that we can not fall victim to zero sum thinking, which is like probably one of the criteria for tribalism to really take hold. And if we can keep ourselves in the domain of positive sum, both thinking and like actual positive sum things happening in our DAOs and community, then we might protect ourselves a little bit better from tribalism. But like the social stuff becomes it's very easy for people to see that as zero sum. When one person gains kind of new social status or new social rights, it's very easy, unfortunately, for other people to see that as themselves losing. And I think that's an unfortunate source of a lot of the tribalistic tendencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also encourages more extreme behaviors as well, as people are competing for that social status and trying to game the algorithms and saying the most controversial things just to get more engagement and things like that, as we see. Yeah. I asked you this question the last time you were here 3 years ago, and your answer was kind of funny, just given, the times. But I think I asked something to the effect of like, are there any examples of DAOs we've seen that have not followed this anti-capture framework well to their demise? And I think you at that time you said something to the effect of, well, we just haven't seen really many DAOs fail yet, so I have no idea, I can't say. And obviously, today we've seen many DAOs fail, and so the landscape is totally different. But I'm going to ask you the same question: have we seen any DAOs fail over the last 3 years due to, at least from your perspective, this anti-capture issue?
Yes, at this point, yes. Though frustratingly, the way my brain tends to work is not very good at remembering the names of things like this, but there is definitely the case that there have been lots of projects that thought they were kind of going in one direction, totally didn't think about what the stuff they needed to be thinking about, and as a result just kind of ran away in different ways. I mean, rugs are like the predominant form of capture in some sense. There are more insidious forms that impact more real organizations. One, I think, from fairly long ago now was DAM. And I don't think this was anybody was intending to capture it, but it was one of the mirror fundraising projects that was attempting to build a decentralized autonomous media network. And I don't think this was like malicious by anybody, but all the money ended up going into a multi-sig, and it was very unclear who was controlling it. And there was no kind of accountability for that. And I think everything just sort of like dissipated as a result. This is probably like one of the mildest forms, but just like not having the community actually being in control of the community's resources, even if it didn't end up in somebody like literally stealing the money, the result was everything kind of just fizzled out and died. So that's the one I remember the best, because I was like partially involved, but there have been, many.
Countless, yeah. And some are malicious and some are sort of just unintentional, like the example that you just gave. But hopefully we can learn from past mistakes and not make the same ones moving forward. And I'm saying that both in the context of DAOs and crypto, as well as more broadly outside of crypto in the US government. Hopefully we'll see a stop to tribalism somehow and, somehow coming out of it. Do you think we'll come out of it? Or do you think this is just the new reality that's gonna, who knows, take our country down? I mean, I don't want to get too, I'd like to stay optimistic, but.
Let's put it this way. My optimism for society and humanity comes from the work and the technology and the new capabilities and possibilities that are coming from the Ethereum ecosystem and not from outside of it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That might be our best bet nowadays, is just to focus on our work and focus on what we're building here. Well, Spencer, any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
We have a long road ahead of us to build the kind of things that we need to build, but that road has still been really fun for the last 3-4 years. And I really hope that it continues to be fun, because that's the way that we're going to keep our energy up and stay focused. So here's to resisting capture and having fun along the way.
Hear, hear. I love that as a way to wrap us up. Spencer, where can people find you if they want to follow you personally and keep up with your work and your writings?
Yeah, so best place to follow me personally is still on Twitter at Spengra, and best place to follow what I'm working on is either there or at hatsprotocol.xyz or at hatsprotocol on Twitter as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us again. And hopefully we won't wait another 3 years before having you back on the podcast.
We'll see what the community says about that, I suppose.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much, Spencer. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted and produced by me, Diana Chen. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Warpcast and Lens at Rehash. And join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week.